Hey vinyl community, welcome to RB's Vinyl Corner. Now, if this is the first time you are tuning in on one of my videos, you most probably have been looking on Shakin Stevens and you winded up somehow on my channel. Now, if this is the first time you watch a video and you like this one, I would highly recommend you to visit my page, because on my page there are a couple more Shaky Stevens related videos, but also a lot of other stuff, like a lot of Elvis Presley. So if you like that stuff as well, my channel is the place to be, because I discuss a lot of great Elvis Presley records. So if you like this video, visit my channel and please subscribe so that you don't have to miss any other video I'm coming up with in the future. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I discussed this mammoth box set, which is called The Fire in the Blood, the definitive collection of Shaky Stevens. And let me tell you what an amazing set this is. I've been talking about this in a video, and I showed you everything which is inside. I will show you a little bit of this also in this video. But when this was released, it really re-sparked my passion for Shaky Stevens music. And this was released in November last year, and I have been playing this a couple of times every week ever since it came out, and I'm still not getting tired of it. There's so much material in this box set that it just keeps you going and it keeps you going. A great set. Now, this one inspired me to talk about each album that is inside this box set. Like I told you before, it collects all the studio albums he did in his solo career. And in some of the previous videos, I already talked about Shaky, which is my most favorite Shaky Stevens album from 1981. I talked about Give Me Your Heart Tonight, which is the follow-up to the Shaky album. Then I fast-forwarded a little bit and talked about Let's Boogie and Lipstick, Powder, and Paint. And now it's time to just pick another album of this set and discuss that as well. And for today's video, I chose the 1990 album There's Two Kinds of Music, Rock and Roll. Now, by the time this fantastic album, There's Two Kinds of Music, Rock and Roll, was released, Shakin Stevens' popularity had basically declined a lot. And this, like entering the 90s, it was a very difficult time for artists that were making more like traditional music. We're talking about a time when hip-hop music, rap music, dance music, electronic music was really gaining popularity, especially amongst the youth. So a lot of youngsters started to listen to that popular music. And even in the rock scene and in the hard rock and metal scene, we had the rise of the popularity of the grunge music. So for a lot of like more traditional based musicians, it was actually a very hard time to gain ground or to sustain their popularity. And with Shakin Stevens, he already built a very loyal fan base. But just remember that I think a lot of his popularity he had to thank for the rock and roll revival in the end of the 70s and in the early 80s. Because remember that when Shakin Stevens, before he really started to gain his popularity and when he started to get ground in the masses and in the audience, he was already active for over a decade in that scene, making contemporary rock and roll music in a time like in the 70s, in a time when we got the rise of progressive rock bands, hard rock and metal really started to gain ground. Bands like Deep Purple, like Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, they came with modern rock music, which pushed the classical music a little bit like to the background. and there were still like a handful of rock and roll artists, but let's even the established names in the rock and roll industry back in those days, Jerry Lee Lewis, Elvis Presley, Roy Orbison, the Everly Brothers, like Chuck Berry, all these artists, although they had their loyal fan base already, they didn't score any hits in the 70s. All those big hits were all reserved for those progressive rock bands. But then toward the end of the 70s and in the early 80s, we all of a sudden had this enormous revival of traditional rock and roll music, rockabilly music. This is a time when bands like the Stray Cats started to gain ground. And this is where Shakin' Stevens also started to get his popularity. And I think a lot of this also we have to thank for the popularity of a movie, for example, like Grease, that really put this old music back in the spotlights again. And in a time when this rock and roll music really had its massive revival, Shakin' Stevens simply was among the best of the artists that this rock and roll scene had to offer. He had basically had it all. He had the looks, he had the moves, the charisma, the wonderful voice, the keen ear for great songs, the musicians, the production. He had everything that was the perfect recipe for success in a time when rock and roll had its revival. So especially in the first half of the 80s, we have seen a lot of rock and roll based musicians. He was on the top. He scored hit after hit after hit after hit. And then in the second half of the 80s, the popularity of that rock music started to decline again, started to get pushed back to the background. And then this is a time where a lot of other new musicians, we had the new wave, the synthesizer-based music, and then like the hard rock and the glam rock that really started to get popularity, and then the hip-hop rap scene and the disco music scene. So you can also see that Shakin' Stevens tried to walk different avenues in the second part of the 80s, coming with more disco-oriented music. Think about, for example, songs like Breaking Up My Heart, which was like really disco-based. And then he started to try to do some Motown sound, but it didn't really work out well for him. He scored some hits, he sold his albums, mainly to his already established fan base. But toward the end of the 80s, it was basically done for him. And this really started to decline. And this was actually, this album, this was his return to his roots. This was just going back to the rock and roll music he gained his popularity with in the first place. And it is a great album, but it was simply too late. It came in a time that rock and roll music did not have the popularity anymore. The revival was already gone. And I think that's partly to blame for the loss of popularity for Shakin' Stevens toward the end of the 80s and in the early 90s. And then remember that this was actually the last full-length album that he recorded for the Epic label. After this, he would record another single. Remember that after this came the Christmas album, but after the Christmas album, he recorded Radio with Roger Taylor from Queen. And on Radio, you already hear that he wanted to just catch up with the times to come up with a more modern sound. And it really worked well, because Radio is actually a fantastic song. I have the feeling, though, that they did not really put a lot of effort anymore in promoting this stuff. And that was basically the end of his career with the Epic label. I think this is a great, great album. It has fantastic tunes, great songs. But it's criticized, especially within his loyal fan base, for the production. Now, I have to be completely honest that I don't really understand, because I think it's actually a very well sounding record. Now, if you're gonna ask me to compare this with, for example, a Shaky album of Give Me Your Heart Tonight, okay, those albums are superior to this one. I gotta be completely honest about that. But nevertheless, this album has great energy and has great tunes. Sometimes an album might not have been doing so well in general, but could have emotional value, which makes it more worth for you. And in this case, I got some pretty special memories from the time that this album came out. Because back in the day, back in the early 90s, there was no such thing as YouTube or internet or Spotify or all that stuff. If you wanted to listen to music, you actually had to go to a record store and buy it, or listen it in a record store or whatever, or hear it on the radio or on the television. Now, like I told you, Shakin' Stevens was not really popular anymore in those times, so you did not see him on television, especially here in Holland. I cannot recall seeing him on TV even once. The albums didn't chart at all, and it was actually very hard to find any Shakin' Stevens records or CDs or whatever in record stores. Sometimes you would bump into a cassette tape or in a budget CD, like what most of the time consisted of Sunsets material. But really, like latest Shakin' Stevens releases in Holland was pretty hard to find, especially for a young kid as I was. All right, I can imagine that if you were an adult back in those days, it was a little bit easier. But for a young kid that like I was like what 12 years or 13 years back in those days that this was released. It was pretty hard to get this stuff. So most of the Shaky Stevens albums that I did buy back in the day were actually records that I found on thrift stores, in in used LP bins, or on flea markets. So by the time this was released, I did not have any idea about what his whole catalog actually looked like and what kind of albums he did. A lot of the songs I heard for the first time when the Epic Years album came out after this one. So that was like, I think in 1993. So I bumped into a CD version of this one. Now, back in the early 90s, when CDs started to get really popular, they were very expensive. CDs were like 40 guilders, which is approximately 18 to 20 euros a piece. So they were extremely expensive. They were more expensive than they were actually these days. So for a kid my age, it was hardly possible to buy those. And I bumped into the CD version of this is where the great memories come from. I bumped into this CD version in a record store, and it was incredibly expensive. I just really wanted to have this, but I did not have the money for this. So every week I would go back to the record store, because remember that you could listen to music actually in the record store. And I would go back to the record store and listen. And every time when I came in, the lady behind the desk already knew what I was about to do, picking the CD and playing it. And this is how I listened to this album for the first time, through a headphone in an actual record store, and then after that putting it back in the bins because I just simply couldn't afford that CD. And but I loved it. When I heard this for the first time, it was like hearing new Shakin' Stevens music for a very long time. It was really exciting. And in the end, and here comes the nice touch in this story, when I came there for like maybe the 20th time or even more, listening to the CD again, the lady actually sold me the CD for half the price. She said, well, you know, you have been listening to this so often that it actually became a used CD now, and you will get it for half the price. And this is where I went to my parents and asked for the additional money on my pocket money, went back and finally bought There's Two Kind of Music, Rock and Roll. And this is how I owned it on CD for the very first time. And so this is how this became one of my actually favorite Shakin' Stevens albums. Now let's look at the artwork. Look at the sleeve. Isn't this a fantastic sleeve? I can easily say this is one of the most beautiful Shakin' Stevens sleeves of his whole catalog. I love it. It's absolutely stunning. The pink, this pose. The original album was released on the Epic label, but the one I have here is actually the version that was released on the Telstar label. Now the flip side is actually, you see Shaky Stevens from the back, and we have this great pink Let Us Rock and Roll here, which is absolutely amazing, and then the track listing. 12 songs. Love Attack, I Might, Yes I Do, You Shake Me Up, Tell Me, Tear It Up, which he actually also did with the Sunsets, My Cutie Cutie, Nighttime is the Right Time, Pink Champagne, If I Lose You, Queen of the Hop, and Rocking the Night Away. Great set of songs. Again, the pink is really cool, and it would also become a theme of most of the video clips that came from this album. Now, we're gonna look at the vinyl here. Like I already told you, this is the Telstar version, so this obviously has the Telstar label, the blue label. The vinyl of this record, by the way, is completely clean, without scratches, and it sounds like, well, amazing. And that's basically the this two kind of music rock and roll album. Again, guys, I know that for a lot of Shaky Stevens fans, this was an album that they heavily criticized for production. But for me, especially with the memories it came from and the way I actually got introduced to the music on this album, makes this one of my favorite albums. Next to Shaky, this is easily one of my favorite Shaky Stevens albums. Great songs, and his voice was amazing here, but it's also his last true rock and roll album, and only therefore already a very special place in my heart. Shakin' Stevens. There's two kinds of music, rock and roll. I hope you liked this video. If you did like it, please thumbs up, comment, tell me some of your memories from this album. Tell me if you like it or not like it, and tell me why you don't like it. Tell me what you think about the production. Tell me everything you know about the credits, because it's very hard to find who actually played on this album, because a lot of the credits and a lot of the recording information is very hard to find. If you have any information on this, I would highly appreciate if you tell me something about it in the comments of this video. If you like this video, please check out some of my other videos. Become a member or a subscriber to my channel so that you don't have to miss any other videos anymore. And let's discuss this, because as always, I like to talk about these records that I love so much, and you obviously also love so much. Shaky Stevens, two kinds of music, rock and roll, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, take care.